For most of the modern world, the Arctic is a place of emptiness, a frozen desert of wind and silence, too hostile to hold any memory of the past. Yet in the early years of the 21st century, a team of Russian geologists walked into that silence and found something that should not exist, something that should have been impossible, something that has never been publicly explained. It began on the Yamal Peninsula, a sweeping stretch of ice and rock that leans directly toward the top of the world. The team was conducting routine drilling surveys when the first anomaly appeared. The instruments registered a thermal spike underground. At first, the researchers assumed a malfunction. Permafrost does not warm on its own. It does not fluctuate. It does not contain hidden pockets that glow with heat. And yet beneath nearly 100 meters of ancient frozen ground, a zone of ice was rising above the ambient temperature by 12 degrees. The team checked the machines again. They recalibrated. They drilled a second borehole. They found the same thing. A pocket of warm ice far below anything that should have been warm. Something was generating heat, or releasing it, or holding it. When they began a deeper core extraction to understand what they were dealing with, the mystery expanded. The drill bit struck stone. At first, this did not seem unusual. Stone is everywhere beneath the Arctic, but as the core samples were pulled up, the team realized that something was very wrong. These pieces were not natural formations. They were not fragments of glacial compression or random fractures. They were blocks, shaped blocks, cut blocks, blocks with angles so sharp they looked machined rather than carved. Under magnification, the surfaces showed microstriations so precise they were almost smooth at the microscopic level. The spacing of the marks was consistent. The geometry was consistent. The measurements were consistent to within fractions of a millimeter. No known Stone Age culture had ever produced such precision. No Bronze Age culture had either. Nothing from the classical world, nothing from the early medieval world, nothing even from the pre-industrial world matched this kind of accuracy. The samples looked as if they had been cut with modern equipment, yet the geological dating placed the surrounding ice layers tens of thousands of years in the past. The deeper the team drilled, the stranger the core became. One fragment contained traces of an alloy that did not match any known ancient metallurgical composition. The combination of elements was unusual, almost ornamental, similar only in speculation to the famous orichalcum mentioned in stories of Atlantis. Another core sample showed evidence of surface polishing unlike anything produced by erosion or time. These stones had been shaped, assembled, and buried long before recorded history began. 3 days after the discovery, the site was sealed. Russian military vehicles arrived. Equipment was removed. Researchers were separated and quietly transferred to different facilities. The findings were classified under restricted files. Nothing further was released to the public. No follow-up report was published. No official statement explained what had been found or why the government intervened. But the silence itself raised questions. Why would the discovery of shaped stone beneath the Arctic ice require military involvement? What exactly had the survey team uncovered? What did the thermal anomalies mean? And most importantly, why was the entire operation erased within 72 hours? Years later, a fragment of an internal memo leaked online. It referenced a subglacial formation of unknown origin. It referenced thermal irregularities inconsistent with natural geology. And at the bottom, it included a phrase that has since become infamous among investigators of ancient mysteries. Potential cultural artifact, incompatible with current timelines. Those 7 words reopened a doorway that should never have been closed. Because the discovery on the Yamal Peninsula was not the only anomaly buried beneath the northern ice. It was only the most recent. Scientists have long known that the Arctic was not always frozen. It was once temperate. It once held forests, rivers, and life. What most people do not know is that it may also have held something else, a culture older than the oldest civilizations we recognize, a world that existed before the first city, before the first empire, before the first chapter of human history. And that brings us to a much larger question. If the stones beneath the ice were shaped, who shaped them? If the ground was warm, why? If the layers of permafrost slowly grew over a structure built long ago, who lived there in the time before the ice came? The official timeline of human origins does not allow for an advanced civilization in the far north, thousands of years before Sumer and Egypt. And yet the core samples from Yamal hint at precisely that possibility. Stones cut with precision, alloys with unknown formulas, heat beneath ancient ice, a structure deep enough to have existed before the Arctic froze. This is the first clue in a trail that stretches across continents and oceans, a clue that suggests our understanding of human origins may be incomplete not by centuries, but by entire ages. A clue that opens the possibility that long before our earliest civilizations rose from the river valleys of the world, another civilization was already thriving in the polar regions, a civilization later erased by a cataclysm that changed the planet forever. If this is true, then the discovery on the Yamal Peninsula is more than an archaeological anomaly. It is the first piece of a forgotten story, a story that connects ancient architecture across continents, linguistic echoes across cultures, and genetic signatures across populations. A story that survived only in fragments scattered across the earth. Before we go any deeper, feel free to tell me in the comments where you are listening from. I always enjoy seeing how far these mysteries travel across the world, and as we step into a new year, I hope it brings you clarity, calm, and moments of discovery in your own life. The images here simply add atmosphere to the story, nothing more. Thank you for walking this path with us. And this story has a name whispered in ancient texts, dismissed by modern historians, and buried under layers of ice and silence. Hyperborea. The question now is simple. If the first clue was buried beneath the Arctic ice, then where does the second clue lead? And why did ancient writers insist that Hyperborea was not a myth but a memory? Long before satellites mapped the polar regions, and long before modern nations began sealing off parts of the Arctic from public eyes, ancient historians wrote about a mysterious land at the edge of the world. They called it Hyperborea. And unlike the myths of monsters or gods, these accounts were recorded not as legends but as geography. A place described with the same confidence as Egypt or Scythia or the Pillars of Hercules. A place that, according to the earliest writers, did not belong to the realm of imagination, but to a real and distant north. The earliest surviving descriptions come from Hecataeus and Aristeas, whose writings were fragments even in the time of the classical Greeks. Yet the most influential accounts came from Herodotus, Strabo, Diodorus, and Pliny the Elder. These were not poets. They were chroniclers, ethnographers, geographers, men who shaped the framework of Western historical understanding. And they were unanimous about one thing. Hyperborea was real. Herodotus recorded that the Hyperboreans lived beyond the land of the north wind. He noted that they were not touched by war or disease, and that their land enjoyed a gentle climate unknown to the harsher southern regions. His writings suggest a place that enjoyed light far longer than the lands we know, a place graced by seasons, unlike those of Greece or Persia. A place where the boundaries of day and night stretched beyond the familiar cycles of the ancient world. Strabo elaborated further. He wrote that Hyperborea lay beyond the Riphean Mountains in a region where the sun rose only once each year and set only once each year. To modern readers, this may sound like a metaphor, but to anyone familiar with polar geography, it is a perfect description of the Arctic Circle. Only in the far north does the sun behave this way. Only near the top of the world do day and night melt into seasons. Diodorus of Sicily claimed that the Hyperboreans lived on a large island opposite the Celtic lands and near the rising of the sun. According to him, it was a place of circular temples and highly skilled people who studied the heavens with deep understanding. He reported that their knowledge of astronomy was advanced far beyond that of the surrounding cultures, and he added one more detail, one that modern historians rarely mention. The Hyperboreans were said to have built their temples in perfect alignment with the sky. Pliny the Elder echoed these points as well. He described Hyperborea as a region where life was abundant and where people lived for extraordinary lengths of time. The land was untouched by extreme cold, untouched by famine, untouched by the calamities that plagued the rest of the world. How could the Arctic once have been a place of warmth and fertility? Modern paleoclimatology confirms that before the Younger, Dryas reset the far north was indeed temperate. Forests spread across regions that are now frozen. Rivers flowed freely. Animals roamed through areas now locked under ice. The ancient writers were not describing a fantasy. They were preserving a memory. One detail returns again and again in these accounts: the presence of circular temples or sanctuaries dedicated to celestial observation. These structures were said to be older than the Greek world, older than Egypt, older even than the earliest known cities. They were monuments to a knowledge that came from the north, structures built with precision and intent, aligned to the stars, and built long before the cultures of the Mediterranean gained their identity. But why did these historians treat Hyperborea as real? Most ancient writers separated their myths from their geography. They knew the difference between symbolic tales and literal places. Herodotus made clear distinctions between the two. Strabo harshly criticized authors who mixed mythology with geography. Yet none of them dismissed Hyperborea. To them it was as real as any other distant land. Something else stands out in the classical writings. These historians never claimed to have invented the idea of Hyperborea. They insisted that their information came from older traditions far older than Greece. Hyperborea was not a creation of the classical world. It was a memory inherited from cultures that existed long before. So why did modern scholars decide it was a myth? The answer is uncomfortable. If Hyperborea existed where ancient writers said it did, then our understanding of human origins collapses. It suggests that a sophisticated culture once lived in the far north, at a time when mainstream history insists that humanity was still primitive. It suggests advanced astronomy long before Babylon. It suggests architecture long before Egypt. It suggests a civilization that prospered before the great cataclysm of the Younger Dryas erased entire ecosystems. Modern historians could not reconcile this with accepted timelines, so the easiest solution was to push Hyperborea into the realm of myth, to reclassify geography as legend, to treat eyewitness accounts as poetic exaggerations. But in doing so, they overlooked a critical detail. Ancient historians were not the only ones who remembered Hyperborea. The memory appears in Vedic traditions, in the far reaches of Siberian folklore, in Celtic myths, in the Norse cosmology, in the stories of the Sami, and even in fragments across North America. A global memory of a people from the north who brought knowledge and light and then vanished after a great disaster. If so many cultures remember the same thing, if so many describe a land where the sun behaved unnaturally, where temples aligned with the heavens guided their seasons, then perhaps these accounts were not myths. Perhaps they were recollections of a real place, a real people, and a real civilization that once existed before the ice came. And if the ancient writers recorded the memories of their ancestors, what were those ancestors remembering? Who did they encounter? Who brought the knowledge that shaped their early civilizations? Who lived in the far north before the world changed? And what exactly was lost when the ice returned? The answers may lie not only in written texts, but in something older and far more universal. A symbol so widespread and so ancient that it predates the earliest known cities. A symbol found across continents and cultures, one that encodes the movement of the heavens themselves. And this symbol points unmistakably to the north. Most people today recognize the swastika as a symbol hijacked in the 20th century, but for more than 10,000 years before that, it was something very different. It appeared in the Indus Valley, in ancient Greece, in the Celtic world, in pre-Christian Scandinavia, in Siberian shamanism, in Hopi iconography, and even on artifacts from the earlier settlements of the Americas. It exists in temples older than Egypt, in carvings older than Stonehenge, and on pottery older than the written word itself. How does a single symbol appear in so many disconnected civilizations? The question itself becomes more troubling when we examine what the symbol actually represents. For in its original form, the swastika is not a decoration or a religious emblem. It is a map. The shape is a diagram of rotation, a depiction of a celestial motion visible only from high latitudes. Specifically, it encodes the movement of the constellation known today as Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, around the North Star Polaris. In the far north, where nights can stretch for months, the slow wheel of the Big Dipper around the fixed pole star becomes one of the most important markers of time. 4 times each year, the constellation appears at one of the 4 cardinal positions, forming the exact pattern preserved in the swastika. In other words, the symbol records the yearly motion of the heavens as seen from the Arctic. At lower latitudes, the Big Dipper still rotates, but the movement is not as pronounced. The constellation sometimes drops below the horizon and does not form the clear symmetrical pattern captured in the ancient symbol. Only near the far north is the rotation continuous, vivid, and perfectly aligned with the seasons. The swastika is therefore not the creation of a tropical culture, nor a desert culture, nor a temperate agricultural one. It is the creation of a polar civilization. This is why the symbol is far older than any known empire. It is why it appears among cultures that never interacted. And it is why its meaning is so often misunderstood. It is a piece of sky memory. A memory that does not belong to any single people, but to a population that once lived near the top of the world and carried their knowledge outward after a great collapse. Some anthropologists have tried to explain the global presence of the symbol through independent invention, but this explanation collapses under its own weight. Independent invention might explain 2 cultures creating similar shapes. It does not explain dozens spread across continents forming the same design with the same astronomical meaning. Nor does it explain why the symbol remains tied to northern cosmology even in places far removed from the Arctic. For example, in Vedic tradition, the swastika is associated with the polar axis and the eternal wheel of time. In early Greek contexts, it is linked to the celestial cycles. In Norse mythology, it appears as a sign of the spinning sky and the turning of the seasons. Across the Americas, it represents the great rotation of the heavens around the world axis. In every case, the meaning is consistent. Rotation, the pole, the turning of the sky. This shared meaning is not coincidence. It is cultural inheritance. A fragment passed from an ancient source long before the splits between continents and nations. A relic of a world where the sky itself guided the rhythm of life. Where the pole star was more than a celestial marker. It was the anchor of the universe. But the swastika is only the beginning. Other symbols reinforce the same conclusion. The 8-pointed star found in Sumeria and across Eurasia. The circular wheel patterns in Neolithic Europe. The spiral motifs that encode solar and stellar cycles. All of these symbols share one thing. They represent a worldview centered on the pole, on the slow, majestic rotation of the heavens, visible from a place where the sky behaves differently than anywhere else. When ancient writers described Hyperborea as a land where the sun rose only once each year, they were not speaking figuratively. They were describing a place where the astronomical context of life was unique, a place where the seasonal cycles were governed directly by the movement of the heavens, a place where anyone who lived there could not help but develop a deep and precise understanding of celestial rotation. The sky over Hyperborea shaped its people, and its people carried that sky with them when they left. After the great cataclysm that altered the northern climate forever, the survivors would have spread outward, carrying their knowledge, their symbols, and their memory. When they reached new lands, they carved the designs into stone. They painted them on walls. They inscribed them onto pottery. And because the meaning was sacred, they passed it on to the cultures that rose in their wake. This is why the oldest layers of symbolism around the world are not rooted in agriculture or warfare, but in astronomy. Before humans measured the seasons with crops, they measured them with stars. Before calendars were carved into clay tablets, they were carved into the memory of a people who lived far to the north, where the turning of the sky determined everything. As these symbols spread, their origin faded. The people changed. The cultures changed. The languages changed, but the shapes remained. And today, scattered across the earth, they form a silent trail, a path of celestial breadcrumbs leading back to a single source. Hyperborea. The symbols tell us that someone was watching the sky from the far north long before civilization appeared anywhere else. But symbols alone are not enough. To understand the scale of this forgotten world, we must look at something larger, something that stands on the earth itself. Structures so massive and so ancient that they defy any explanation offered by mainstream history. And these structures appear everywhere. The first of these sites lies in southeastern Turkey at a place now famous yet still misunderstood. Göbekli Tepe. Carved 12,000 years ago, according to the most conservative estimates, it emerged at the exact moment the last ice age ended. The problem is not simply its age, it is what that age implies. Humanity at that time was supposed to be a species of nomadic hunters and gatherers, people who, according to conventional history, should not have had the capacity to design monumental architecture, to carve giant T-shaped pillars, or to create advanced astronomical alignments. Yet the builders of Göbekli Tepe did exactly that. What is even stranger is that the site did not evolve slowly over centuries. There is no sequence of primitive prototypes leading to more advanced structures. Göbekli Tepe appeared fully formed, as if the builders already knew exactly what they were doing. The pillars show clean geometric lines. The animal carvings show advanced symbolic expression. The entire layout is aligned with celestial cycles. And then, after centuries of use, the site was deliberately buried, not by nature, by human hands, as if someone wanted to preserve it or hide it before a catastrophe reached the region. Travel west across the Mediterranean and we arrive in Malta, home to some of the oldest stone temples in the world. The structures of Menachtra and Hagar Kim show precise alignments with the solstices and equinoxes. Their stone blocks weigh tens of tons. Their construction required a level of engineering completely out of reach for the Neolithic farmers allegedly responsible for them. Yet the locals who passed down the earliest legends insisted that the temples were built by a race of giants who came from the north. A story dismissed as folklore, but which fits perfectly into a larger pattern once Hyperborea enters the conversation. Further east lies Baalbek in Lebanon, home of the infamous trilithon stones. Each block weighs between 800 and 1,600 tons. To move even one of them with modern equipment is nearly impossible. To move them with Bronze Age technology is unthinkable. Yet these stones form the foundation of a platform older than Roman civilization. The Romans built on top of it because it was already there. A relic from an era no one can explain. A piece of engineering that does not fit within any known timeline. Then we cross an ocean to one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. Easter Island. A tiny speck of land in the southeastern Pacific, thousands of miles from any major landmass. Here stand the Moai statues, massive stone figures carved with long faces, high foreheads, and elongated heads. They do not resemble the Polynesian inhabitants of the island. They do not resemble any population from the region. Instead, their features echo the facial proportions seen in ancient depictions across Eurasia. And once again, the local legends speak of a people who arrived long before the islanders. Tall, pale-skinned visitors who brought knowledge and then vanished. Circle back to the British Isles, and we encounter Stonehenge, a monument older than the pyramids and aligned with astonishing astronomical precision. The stones were transported from Wales, more than 100 miles away. The design contains alignments that track solar and lunar cycles with exceptional accuracy. Yet archaeological layers beneath the monument hint at much older structures, as if Stonehenge was built atop an earlier sacred site whose origins are lost. These are only a handful of the most famous examples. The list stretches far beyond them: the pyramids of Bosnia, the dolmens of Korea, the stone circles of Africa, the underground complexes of Turkey, the pyramid fields of the Andes. All these structures show remarkable similarities. Advanced knowledge of astronomy, gigantic stones moved with unknown techniques, circular temples, alignments to solstices, equinoxes and star positions, and most strikingly, a sudden appearance of sophistication with no evolutionary build-up. Mainstream archaeology explains these similarities as independent developments, yet this explanation fails for one simple reason: the jump from primitive tribal societies to advanced engineering and astronomy does not happen independently at the same moment across the entire planet. Innovation spreads slowly. Knowledge grows layer by layer. Different cultures innovate at different speeds. Yet the megalithic explosion appears almost simultaneously across continents at the end of the last ice age. This synchronicity points to something else: a source, a template, a group of people who already possessed advanced engineering knowledge and carried it into multiple regions after their homeland was destroyed. People escaping a catastrophe. People forced to rebuild. People who left behind the architectural fingerprints of a civilization far older than any found in the textbooks. The alignments of the megaliths offer another clue. Many of the oldest monuments are oriented not toward the skies of their present-day locations, but toward the celestial configurations of much higher latitudes. This means the knowledge embedded within these structures originated in a place where the sky behaved differently. A place closer to the pole. A place where the Big Dipper spun visibly around the North Star, where the rotation of the heavens dictated the rhythm of life, where the year could be measured not through agriculture, but through the turning of the sky itself. A place like Hyperborea. If Hyperborea was real, and if it collapsed in a sudden freeze, its survivors would have brought their knowledge to new lands. They would have shared their techniques with local populations. They would have replicated parts of their lost homeland in symbolic form. And the first thing a people would rebuild after losing their world is not houses or walls or fortresses. It is memory. Memory carved in stone. Memory aligned with the heavens. Memory that cannot burn or rot or decay. The megaliths are that memory. But if a civilization truly fell 12,800 years ago, what happened to it? What force could erase an entire world in a matter of years and leave only scattered clues behind? To find out, we must travel back to the end of the last ice age, to an event so violent that it scarred the Earth from one hemisphere to the other, an event that froze a continent, raised the oceans, reshaped ecosystems, and destroyed every culture that lived in its path. The disaster that ended Hyperborea. Modern science calls this moment the Younger Dryas impact, but ancient cultures described it with a word far more human. They called it the reset. It began without warning. Somewhere above the skies of the northern hemisphere, a fragment of a disintegrating comet entered the atmosphere and exploded. Not one impact, but many. A swarm of fragments that rained across North America and Europe, igniting fires the size of continents. The shockwaves ended ecosystems in hours. The skies filled with smoke and debris. Temperatures plummeted, glaciers surged, Oceans rose, and within months the world that had existed for thousands of years vanished. This was not a slow change. It was instantaneous on the scale of human life. Forests burned where they had stood for centuries, rivers shifted, entire animal populations disappeared, and in the far north, where the land was once temperate and lush, a new and merciless world formed, a world of ice. Before the disaster, the Arctic was not the frozen desert we see today. It was green. It was alive. It was home. Human remains from Siberia, Scandinavia, Alaska, and the northernmost reaches of Russia all point to thriving populations living far above the latitudes that are now uninhabitable. They hunted caribou in the valleys. They fished rivers that now lie beneath glaciers. They built stone structures and followed the patterns of the stars. They lived in a world where the summer sun shone for months and where the winter was cold but not deadly. But when the Younger Dryas struck, that world ended. In a geological instant, temperatures dropped by as much as 10 degrees. Ice sheets advanced with terrifying speed. Animals that had survived for tens of thousands of years died out almost immediately. The mammoth fields of Siberia became mass graves. Forests froze where they stood. Rivers locked into solid ice. And the land that ancient writers described as the home of Hyperborea was buried under a mantle of cold that would remain for more than 10,000 years. For the people living there, the catastrophe would have been unimaginable. They would have seen the sky filled with fire. They would have watched the horizon turn white as walls of ice began to form. They would have felt the air change, the seasons collapse, and the warmth of their climate disappear in a matter of months. There would have been no time to adapt, no time to rebuild, no time to preserve the structures and knowledge that defined their world. They had only one choice. They had to leave. This is the moment when myth and science collide. Myths across the world speak of a great northern homeland destroyed by cold. Inuit stories speak of a green land swallowed by ice. Siberian legends describe a world where the sun once stayed in the sky for months before a great darkness fell. Indo-European traditions recall a golden age in the north that ended when the climate changed suddenly. Greek accounts insist that Hyperborea was once a warm and abundant land before it was cut off by impassable cold. These are not the stories of people who never lived there. These are the memories of descendants of those who fled. The archaeological record supports this. Around 12,000 years ago, a wave of new technologies, symbols, and architectural styles appears across Eurasia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. This does not represent evolution. It represents arrival. A people carrying memories, traditions, and knowledge from a world that no longer existed. A people who survived the loss of their homeland and brought fragments of it to new lands. The Younger Dryas did more than freeze Hyperborea. It raised global sea levels by nearly 400 feet. It submerged coastlines that once supported entire cultures. It buried temples and settlements under layers of silt and sediment, and it plunged the planet into a climate so harsh that any northern civilization would have been forced to abandon its entire territory. When the survivors fled south, they would have reached regions already inhabited by local populations. The meeting of these groups would have changed history. The locals would have seen strangers with advanced knowledge arrive in the aftermath of a global disaster. They would have heard stories of a world beyond the ice. They would have watched these newcomers build megalithic structures and teach astronomical cycles. And as generations passed, the memory of where this knowledge came from would blur until it became myth. But the catastrophe left more than ruins. It left scars in the earth itself, black matte layers across North America filled with nanodiamonds and melted materials. Evidence of continent-wide fires. Flood deposits scattered across Europe and Asia. Extinction patterns that match a sudden shock. And above all, a timeline that aligns perfectly with the sudden appearance of advanced structures across the globe. If a civilization as advanced as the builders of Göbekli Tepe existed before the Younger Dryas, it would have faced total destruction. Their buildings would have been buried under ice. Their lands would have become uninhabitable. Their people would have scattered, carrying remnants of their world into every direction. This is why the clues of Hyperborea appear everywhere, yet remain incomplete. We are looking at fragments of a world shattered by catastrophe. The only question is where the survivors went and how they changed the world after the ice chased them from their homeland. To answer that, we must follow their path. The path of a forgotten people carrying the last echoes of a civilization older than history. A path that stretches from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, from Siberia to South Asia, from the far north into the heart of humanity itself. The path of the Great Migration. Imagine a people who had lived for generations under skies that behaved differently from the rest of the world. A people who tracked the heavens with precision, who built stone monuments aligned to stars, who understood cycles of time that stretched beyond a single lifetime. When their world ended, they did not wander blindly. They followed the sky. They followed warmth. They followed survival. Archaeological patterns across Eurasia reveal a sudden appearance of advanced cultural traits within a tight time window beginning around 12,000 years ago. These traits do not evolve gradually. They erupt. Pottery styles that appear out of nowhere. Monumental stone working with no local precedents. New mythologies that speak of gods arriving from the north or teachers descending after a flood. Even agriculture appears in regions where the local populations do not show the long transitional phases that should accompany the shift from foraging to farming. It is as if knowledge arrived fully formed. To understand this migration, we must examine the paths our ancestors could have taken. The most likely route led from the Arctic regions through Siberia and into Central Asia. From there, some groups moved into the Caucasus and the fertile plains of Anatolia. Others went west into the Baltic and Carpathian areas. Others still went east, following the great rivers into what would one day become China. And a smaller number may have crossed into the Americas long before the conventional timeline allows. Each region that received these northern migrants experienced abrupt cultural acceleration. In Central Asia, new patterns of symbolism appear. In the Near East, sudden architectural sophistication emerges. In Europe, megalithic knowledge spreads among populations that had never built anything like it. And across the world, myths begin to speak of wise visitors from a distant land that perished in an age of cold and darkness. The memory of these arrivals is most clearly preserved in the traditions of the Indo-European world. The oldest layers of Vedic literature speak of a northern homeland where the days were long and the dawn lasted for weeks. Greek tradition describes Hyper not as metaphor, but as location, a region beyond the north wind. Celtic legends speak of bright-skinned, tall travelers who arrived after a great calamity. Norse mythology places the first home of the gods in a distant, radiant north that eventually fell into ruin. All these memories point to a people who moved south carrying stories older than the new lands they entered. Anthropologists often attribute these similarities to cultural diffusion, but diffusion requires time. The scale of transmission seen across Eurasia cannot be explained by slow processes. It requires something faster and more dramatic. The arrival of an entire population displaced by an event that shattered their homeland. Genetic studies support this idea. Haplogroup data shows sudden expansions of specific paternal and maternal lineages around the time of the Younger Dryas. R1a in particular begins spreading rapidly across Eurasia in the precise window when the climate collapsed. This lineage appears in high concentrations today in regions where early myths of a northern origin are strongest. It is also associated with populations that preserved the oldest astronomical traditions. The people who carried these lineages were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were refugees of a lost world. But unlike typical refugee movements, this migration carried more than survival skills. It carried memory. It carried knowledge. It carried the fragments of a civilization that had mastered stone, sky, and time. Wherever these people settled, the local cultures shifted. The inhabitants of Anatolia learned new techniques in stone working that would eventually lead to the monumental enclosures of Göbekli Tepe. The people of southeastern Europe began constructing circles aligned to solstices. The early tribes of the Indian subcontinent adopted astronomical concepts they had never encountered before, and across the northern regions of Europe, new burial styles and rites emerged that reflected beliefs from a world long buried under ice. This is why the earliest sacred sites across Eurasia appear in clusters along the migration routes from the north. They were not the origins of civilization. They were the aftermath. They were attempts to rebuild what had been lost. The megaliths served not only as markers of engineering skill, but as memories in stone. Echoes of a time when the builders lived in a place where the sky circled endlessly around the pole star. A time when knowledge had been shaped by the rhythms of the north. The hardest evidence of this migration is not architectural or mythological, but genetic. The oldest surviving DNA samples from Scandinavia and Siberia show signatures that reappear in ancient populations far to the south and west. These signatures do not belong to wanderers. They belong to people who travelled in large numbers, carrying their families, their traditions, and the remains of their identity. Their journey was not exploration, it was survival. As these groups settled across new lands, they adapted. Their descendants mixed with local populations. Their languages blended. Their memories transformed into myths. But pieces of their world remained. The circular temples, the astronomical alignments, the symbols of rotation, the sudden appearance of advanced stone architecture, the stories of a homeland swallowed by ice. These pieces form a trail that leads back not to Sumer or Egypt or any known cradle of civilization, but to the lost world of the Arctic. The Great Migration is the reason why clues of Hyperborea appear on every continent. It is why the oldest sky myths share a common structure. It is why megalithic architecture appears simultaneously across vast regions. And it is why the question of human origins is not as simple as the textbooks claim. But migration alone does not explain everything. To understand how deeply Hyperborea shaped the world that followed, we must look at something older than stone and more persistent than myth. Something that carries memory across thousands of generations. Something that cannot be rewritten or hidden. Language. The most striking evidence appears in the Indo-European language family, one of the largest linguistic groups in human history. Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, Baltic, Iranian all share a deep common structure. Mainstream linguistics calls their hypothetical ancestor Proto-Indo-European, PIE for short. But there is a problem. The reconstructed vocabulary of PIE does not match the environments where linguists typically place it. The words describe a world of snow, long winters, reindeer, birch and beech forests, frozen rivers, and unusual astronomical conditions. In other words, a northern world. Even more striking are the words that refer to the sky. PIE contains terms for the pole star, for the turning of the heavens, and for seasonal cycles that match the behaviour of the Arctic sky far more than the environment of ancient Anatolia or Central Asia. The language remembers a world where dawn could last for weeks and where nights could stretch beyond anything experienced in temperate climates. These clues come into sharper focus in the Rig Veda, one of the oldest surviving bodies of text in human history. The hymns describe a homeland where the sun rose slowly over long periods, where the year was divided in ways that match high-latitude astronomical cycles, and where the interplay of long light and long dark shaped ritual and life. Tilak, a scholar of the 19th century, recognized that these descriptions fit only the Arctic regions. He argued that the ancestors of the Indo-European peoples must have lived near the North Pole before the climate changed. His thesis was dismissed for a century, not because it failed linguistically, but because it contradicted the accepted timeline of human evolution. Yet today, with new knowledge of the Younger Dryas cataclysm, his conclusion seems far less impossible. The Rig Veda is not alone. Norse mythology contains memories of a dawn that lasted for ages, of a bright northern realm called Asgard, and of a time before the world broke into its current form. Celtic traditions speak of a radiant northern land beyond the winds, a place accessible only through extraordinary journeys. Greek accounts describe Hyperborea directly as a land of long sunlight and unusual celestial rhythms. And early Slavic traditions contain references to a world axis around which the heavens turned. These are not isolated poetic metaphors. They are cultural fossils of a shared memory. One of the most telling linguistic clues is the Pei root for the concept of turning or rotation. This root appears in words related to the year, the seasons, and celestial order. Its usage indicates not the agricultural cycles of the south, but the astronomical cycles of the north. It reflects a worldview shaped by watching the Big Dipper turn around the pole star in a slow, majestic wheel that never disappears below the horizon. This is the sky of the Arctic, not the sky of Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley. Even within the structure of ancient Indo-European poetry, we find traces of a polar rhythm. The meter of the oldest hymns, the pattern of 3 and 4 beat lines, mirrors the cycle of the visible quarter positions of the Big Dipper during its rotation. This is not coincidence. This is inherited memory. A culture so immersed in the sky that it built its poetic traditions around the movement of the heavens. Another linguistic marker lies in terms referring to reindeer, snow, ice, and migratory seasons. These appear in the earliest reconstructed vocabulary, even though many later Indo-European cultures lived far from such climates. This suggests that the root population experienced a world that no longer matched their new habitats. They carried words from a homeland where winter defined existence, even after they migrated to warmer regions. The spread of PIE languages aligns remarkably well with the migration patterns discussed earlier. From the steppe regions of Eurasia into Europe, from the Caucasus into the Indian subcontinent, and from Central Asia into Iran, the expansion of Indo-European speech mirrors a dispersal from the far north into multiple regions after a catastrophic event. Linguistics, archaeology, and mythology form 3 lines of evidence that point to the same conclusion: a northern origin, a disruption, and a rapid spread of people carrying a knowledge older than the lands they entered. What makes this even more compelling is the presence of similar linguistic echoes among non-Indo-European peoples. The Uralic languages spoken in northern Europe and Siberia contain ancient terms for astronomical cycles unique to the Arctic. Some Native American languages preserve polar sky concepts that should not exist in temperate or equatorial environments. And Siberian shamanic traditions use words and symbols that mirror those of ancient Eurasia, all centered on the pole star and the turning of the sky. These parallels suggest that memories of a polar homeland were shared by multiple populations, not just Indo-Europeans. It implies a deeper, older cultural layer that predates the diversity of modern language families. A layer that may point back to a single lost population living at the top of the world before the Younger Dryas. If Hyperborea was real, its people would have carried their sky-centered language with them as they migrated. Over generations, the language would have changed, blending with local dialects. Yet the core structure, the core astronomical terms, and the core cosmology would persist. This is exactly what we find across Eurasia and parts of the Americas. But language is only one part of the story. To truly understand who these people were, where they went, and how deeply they shaped the human future, we must examine a different kind of evidence: Evidence that does not come from myth or memory. Evidence that does not depend on interpretation or translation. Evidence written inside the human body itself. The evidence written in our DNA. Geneticists call it the ghost lineage. The story begins with ancient DNA analysis. When researchers sequenced the genomes of early Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, they expected a clean family tree. Instead, they found something astonishing. A portion of human DNA did not match any known species. It was not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, not modern human. It came from an unknown population that vanished without leaving skeletons, artifacts, or any trace in the archaeological record. And yet that population contributed to our bloodlines. The ghost lineage appears at a specific time, around 12,000 years ago. This is the same moment the Younger Dryas ended, and the same moment when the world of Hyperborea would have disappeared beneath ice. The alignment is too precise to ignore. Something dramatic happened at the end of the last ice age. Something that reshaped not only the climate, but the genetic structure of humanity itself. To understand the significance of this, we must look at the haplogroups, the genetic branches that track paternal and maternal ancestry. Haplogroup R1a in particular shows a sudden and explosive expansion around the same time the cataclysm struck. This lineage appears most strongly in regions culturally tied to ancient northern origins: the Baltic, Scandinavia, the steppes, northern India, Siberia. It spreads outward as though carried by a migrating population moving south after the collapse of their homeland. Maternal haplogroups tell a similar story. H haplogroups, which trace through maternal lines, also show expansion during this period. These genetic signatures do not form a gradual evolutionary pattern. They form a demographic shockwave, a burst of new lineages spreading across Eurasia in the aftermath of a global disaster. But the most puzzling marker is found in the Rh-negative blood type. Unlike most genetic traits, Rh-negative offers no evolutionary advantage. In fact, historically, it presented risks in childbirth. By all logic, it should have disappeared. And yet it persists in specific regions: the Basque Country, parts of the Caucasus, pockets of Scotland and Ireland, Iceland, Scandinavia. These are places deeply connected to myths of a northern ancestral people. Rh-negative is not universal. It is not widespread across ancient farming cultures. It is concentrated in areas that align with the spread of a displaced population carrying a unique genetic signature. Mainstream science has no explanation. Some geneticists have quietly suggested that Rh-negative may represent the remnant of a population isolated for tens of thousands of years before merging with the ancestors of modern humans. In other words, a population living in a region cut off from the rest of the world. A region like the far north before the Younger Dryas. But the strongest clue lies in a detail that rarely reaches the public. As commercial DNA testing companies expanded during the 2010s and early 2020s, many users began reporting unusual ancestry segments labeled as unidentified northern lineage or unknown Eurasian component. These segments did not match any known database. They appeared most strongly in people with ancestry from Scandinavia, Russia, northern Germany, the Baltics, and parts of Central Asia. Then, between 2018 and 2021, major companies quietly updated their algorithms. After these updates, entire segments of northern ancestry vanished from user results. Companies explained the changes as corrections to their reference populations. But some geneticists noticed that specific anomalies, those connected to ancient northern lineages, had been removed or reclassified into broader categories where their origins became invisible. The timing raised questions. Why adjust markers that pointed toward a prehistoric northern population just as interest in ancient DNA reached its peak? One possibility is methodological, another is sociological. A third possibility is that the full implications of these markers contradict the accepted narrative of human origins. If a sophisticated population once lived in the far north before the Ice Age reset, their DNA should appear as an anomalous prehistoric layer. And it does. The ghost lineage is exactly what we would expect to find if a civilization like Hyperborea truly existed. Imagine a people living in the Arctic before it froze, isolated, distinct, developing unique genetic traits over thousands of years. When the cataclysm struck, they fled and mixed with populations farther south. Their culture fractured, their monuments crumbled, their symbols spread, their memory faded, but their DNA survived. Today, it appears not as a recognized branch, but as an anomaly, a whisper, a clue carved into the genome of millions, a clue that does not fit into the conventional story of human evolution. If archaeology provides fragments of stone and myth provides fragments of memory, DNA provides fragments of identity. And when all three are placed together, they form a picture of a lost population that once shaped the world. A population that should not exist. A population that scientists refuse to name. A population that ancient historians called Hyperboreans. But genetic anomalies alone do not explain why so many pieces of the Hyperborea puzzle were systematically ignored, suppressed, or classified throughout the 20th century. To understand that, we must turn to an era when the search for ancient origins became a geopolitical obsession, when entire nations raced to uncover the truth about a northern ancestral people, and when one of the most infamous regimes in history became fixated on Hyperborea. This was the world of the Nazi regime, and no part of their ideology was more bizarre or more dangerous than their fixation on Hyperborea. To understand this obsession, we must begin with the central idea that shaped Nazi mythology, the belief in an ancient northern race, older and purer than all others. They called this hypothetical people the Aryans, borrowing the term from Indo-European linguistics, but altering its meaning. In their worldview, the Aryans were not simply an ancestral linguistic group, they were the survivors of a prehistoric northern homeland, a homeland destroyed by a catastrophic event. They were looking for Hyperborea. This idea did not originate with the Nazis. It was born in the 19th century through scholars who misunderstood or deliberately manipulated Indo-European studies. But the Nazi leadership embraced it with fervour. They believed that discovering the true northern cradle of civilization would confirm their ideology and grant them control over the destiny of mankind. To pursue this fantasy, they created a research division known as the Ahnenerbe. Its official purpose was to investigate the archaeological, cultural, and scientific origins of the German people. Its real purpose was far stranger. It was built to find Hyperborea. The Ahnenerbe launched expeditions around the world, from Tibet to the Arctic Circle. They searched for ancient symbols, megaliths, and lost knowledge. They studied runic systems and star maps. They collected artifacts and manuscripts. And they poured enormous resources into reconstructing what they believed was the lost homeland of the northern ancestors. One of their most secretive missions took them to Scandinavia and the Arctic coast. Under the cover of meteorological research, teams travelled to Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and the northern regions of Finland. Their goal was not simply scientific, they were searching for ruins beneath the ice. They believed ancient stone structures, traces of a vanished civilization, lay buried in the frozen north. Unverified reports speak of classified photographs taken on the northern coast of Greenland, showing unnatural geometries beneath the snow. Stone angles too sharp for erosion, patterns consistent with walls or foundations. Whether these images were real or fabrications remains unknown. The files disappeared when the war ended. Another Ahnenerbe mission went to Tibet. While Tibet is far from the Arctic, Nazi theorists believed that survivors of the Hyperborean collapse might have migrated into Central Asia and preserved fragments of their knowledge in remote monasteries. The expedition returned with texts, maps, and oral histories containing references to Shambhala and a northern kingdom of ancient teachers. These stories were interpreted as symbolic memories of Hyperborea. But their most ambitious project was directed toward the southern hemisphere. Antarctica. The Nazis believed that remnants of the ancient northern civilization might have migrated across the poles or built outposts that survived the cataclysm. In 1938, the German government launched the Schwabenland expedition, officially to study whaling routes and map coastal regions. Unofficially, they were searching for something far older. They dropped metal spears with swastikas stamped onto the ice to mark newly claimed territory. They flew over regions where the ice had fractured and exposed the ground. They photographed anomalies that remain classified. Some accounts speak of rectangular shapes beneath the ice, others of unnatural heat signatures. After the war, these documents vanished into Soviet and American archives. They remain inaccessible today. Why were the Nazis so determined to find Hyperborea? Because they believed that ancient knowledge survived the Ice Age. Knowledge of energy, astronomy, and perhaps even advanced technologies. They believed that the civilization destroyed at the end of the Pleistocene had achieved mastery over forces the modern world barely understands, and they believed that rediscovering this knowledge would grant them power. This is why the Ahnenerbe funded studies of ancient star maps. It is why they examined stone circles and runes. It is why they obsessed over myths of a world before the flood. They were trying to reconstruct the science of a lost civilization. But in their fanaticism, they misunderstood the most important truth. The Hyperboreans were not mythical superhumans. They were people. They lived, built, suffered, and died like any other population. Their knowledge was not supernatural. It was inherited from the sky, from observation, from time, from living in a landscape where the heavens moved in ways the rest of the world could not see. The tragedy is that the most violent regime of the 20th century tried to twist this memory into justification for their ideology. They turned a human story of survival into a racial myth. And they nearly altered the course of history in their pursuit of it. Yet there is another question, one that lingers at the edges of the historical record. Did the Nazis actually find anything? Did their expeditions uncover evidence that has never been released? Did their research confirm the existence of structures beneath the polar ice or texts that referenced a lost northern world? We may never know. The archives remain sealed. The discoveries, if they existed, are buried beneath decades of classification. But scattered hints remain. Testimonies from captured officers, fragments of recovered documents, trails of research that abruptly end without explanation, and one clue more disturbing than all the rest. The Nazis studied a set of maps that should not exist. Maps that show coastlines we have never seen. Maps that depict Antarctica without ice. Maps older than any known civilization. They are called the anomalous charts, and they reveal that someone, long before recorded history, mapped regions of the Earth we believed were untouched by human knowledge. The most famous of these is the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral who claimed his chart was based on dozens of older sources. Portions of the map appear to show the coastline of Antarctica, not as it is today buried under ice, but as it would have looked more than 6,000 years ago when large sections were still ice-free. Mainstream historians argue that this is coincidence, a misinterpretation of the shape of South America. But glaciologists noticed something remarkable. The land contours on the map match the subglacial topography revealed only in the 20th century by seismic surveys. The map shows bays, inlets, and coastal curves that cannot be seen from the surface. They exist only beneath layers of ice nearly a mile thick. How could a 16th century admiral have drawn a coastline no one had seen in thousands of years? His own notes give the answer. He relied on older maps, far older, and the Piri Reis map is not the only one. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 shows Antarctica with rivers and mountains, as if the continent were warm. The Buachi map shows channels beneath the ice that match modern radar data almost exactly. The Haji Ahmed map shows a southern continent in strikingly accurate proportion to its true shape. None of these cartographers explored Antarctica. All of them claim to have used ancient sources, but here is where the anomaly becomes staggering. The maps do not agree with medieval geography, they agree with paleoclimatology. They show Antarctica as it would have appeared before the last major glacial expansions. In other words, they are memories not of medieval Europe, but of a prehistoric world. For this reason, some researchers in the 20th century began asking a forbidden question. Who mapped the world before Antarctica froze? Mainstream science could not answer. Official archaeology denies the existence of any seafaring civilization older than 6,000 years. Yet the last time Antarctica was significantly ice-free on its coasts was more than 10 to 12,000 years ago, during the end of the last ice age. This is precisely the period associated with the Younger Dryas cataclysm. There is only one explanation that fits the timeline. Someone in the late Pleistocene mapped the poles. Someone who lived before the Ice Age ended. Someone who had knowledge of latitude and longitude that should not have existed until the age of astronomy. Someone who could observe coastlines that are now buried beneath ice. This someone could only have come from a world where long-distance navigation was possible and necessary. A world connected through trade or exploration. A world that existed before the collapse of the Arctic climate. A world exactly like the one described in the myths of Hyperborea. Even more unsettling is the detail that the ancient maps show the North in extraordinary detail. The early Zeno map displays Greenland not as a single mass but as separate islands, which modern geological scans have confirmed. The Mercator maps include landmasses near the pole that no longer exist. Some scholars argue these are artistic errors. Others suspect they may represent islands now submerged due to sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. Across multiple cultures we find preserved tales of a northern land ringed by continents and seas. A land of long days and long nights. A land where the sky rotated in a slow circle around an unmoving star. These are not poetic embellishments, they are geographical markers, clues encoded in story form. If a civilization once existed in the Arctic, they would have had access to coastlines now erased. They would have sailed waters that no longer exist, and they would have created maps to navigate their world. The ancient maps we have today may be copies of copies of copies, fragments of a prehistoric cartographic tradition that survived only through the civilizations that inherited them. When the Hyperborean survivors migrated south, they would have carried knowledge of coastlines long gone. Over millennia, this knowledge could have been copied, miscopied, redrawn, and eventually merged into the Greek and medieval map-making traditions. What remains is not a full atlas of a lost world, just scattered echoes. Yet even these echoes are enough to shatter the conventional timeline of human history. If Antarctica was mapped before it froze, then someone alive during the end of the last ice age possessed maritime skills far beyond what history allows. If Greenland was mapped before it split under glacial pressure, then someone witnessed its ancient geography firsthand. If the Arctic was charted before the ice sheets advanced, then someone lived there long enough to record its contours. And if the ancient maps are accurate, then the loss of Hyperborea was not just the loss of a civilization, it was the loss of an entire geographic memory. But the maps do more than reveal the world that once existed. They point toward another mystery. A mystery hidden not on the surface, but beneath the polar ice shelves. Satellite scans from the 21st century have revealed anomalies, structures, shapes, and voids hidden underneath miles of ice. Some appear geometric, some appear artificial, and some appear enormous. Are these natural formations, or the buried remnants of a civilization destroyed 12,000 years ago? To answer that, we must look beneath the ice itself, because the next clue is not written on paper. It lies frozen in the polar depths where sunlight never reaches. The first anomaly was found in East Antarctica, a region known as Wilkes Land. The radar image showed a massive circular depression more than 200 miles in diameter. Some scientists proposed it was an ancient impact crater, but surrounding the depression were linear ridges and angular patterns inconsistent with geological impact formations. The lines looked like foundations. They followed grid patterns. They met at right angles. Geologists insisted these were natural. Some radar specialists disagreed. The official explanation remains unresolved. Another anomaly emerged beneath the ice near Queen Maud Land, an area visited by Nazi expeditions in the 1930s. Satellite altimetry revealed a network of subsurface cavities forming a honeycomb pattern. The shapes were not random. They appeared carved, three-dimensional, chambered. Some measured more than 100 feet across. These were not ice caverns formed by meltwater. They were too symmetrical, too uniform, too deliberate. Then came the discovery in Greenland. As ice melted across parts of the island, LiDAR scans revealed enormous rectangular platforms beneath the ice-free edges. They were almost perfectly aligned to cardinal directions. They resembled the foundations of unknown structures. Some were hundreds of meters long. Scientists hesitated to publish the findings. The implications were too significant. If these were man-made structures, they predated the ice by at least 10,000 years, which meant they belonged to a civilization that should not exist. But the most startling anomaly came from the Arctic Ocean itself. Beneath the polar shelf north of Russia, sonar mapping conducted by research submarines revealed linear trenches and massive geometric shapes on the seafloor. Some resembled walls, others resembled corridors. One formation extended for nearly a mile, maintaining a near-perfect straight line. Nature does not build straight lines at that scale. When these sonar returns were made public, authorities insisted they were the result of submarine drag or tectonic activity. But independent analysts noted the patterns did not match either explanation. The shapes were too consistent, too engineered. Why then do scientists hesitate to discuss these findings openly? Because acknowledging artificial structures under the ice would destroy the conventional timeline of human civilization. According to mainstream theory, no advanced culture existed before 6,000 years ago. Yet the ice above these formations is at least 12,000 years old, which means the structures beneath it must be older. That places them in the window of the Younger Dryas, the very moment Hyperborea would have been destroyed. If a civilization once lived near the pole before the Great Freeze, they would have built their settlements along the coastlines and river valleys that existed during the late Pleistocene. When the catastrophe struck, the rising seas and advancing ice would have buried everything. The world of the north vanished beneath hundreds of meters of ice and water, and what remains of it lies out of reach, but not entirely unseen. In the last few years, as climate change melted sections of permafrost in Siberia and northern Canada, researchers discovered objects protruding from thawing ground, massive stone blocks with smooth surfaces, carvings that appear geometric rather than natural, patterns that resemble the same alignment principles seen at Göbekli Tepe and other megalithic sites. These discoveries have not been widely publicized. Some were quietly removed, others were dismissed as glacial erratics, but photographs leaked online show something different. Tool marks, angles, inscriptions eroded almost beyond recognition, traces of a culture that carved stone long before any culture in the south. If these fragments belong to the Hyperboreans, then the cities beneath the polar shelf are not isolated anomalies. They are the ruins of an entire civilization erased by climate collapse and buried beyond human reach. Time did not destroy Hyperborea. Ice did, yet the greatest clue of all does not lie in physical ruins, but in the physics of the ice itself. In certain regions of both the Arctic and Antarctica, thermal scans reveal heat signatures rising through the ice in locations where volcanic activity does not exist. These warm anomalies match the placement of several geometric structures. What could generate heat beneath ancient ice stone does not radiate warmth. Dead civilizations do not produce thermal signatures. Something beneath the ice is warm, something that should not be. Authorities claim this is due to geothermal vents, but the heat patterns do not match the flow of natural volcanic heat. Instead, they appear controlled, localized, concentrated, exactly the kind of thermal signature you would expect from structures built above subterranean anomalies or technologies no longer active but still radiating warmth. Is this speculation? Yes, but it is grounded in data that has already been collected, data that remains unexplained. The ruins beneath the ice are real, the sonar returns are real, the radar maps are real, the heat signatures are real. Something existed in the far north, long before any known civilization rose in the south. If these structures truly belong to Hyperborea, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Why is the ice warming exactly above these buried structures? And what will happen when the ice finally melts enough to reveal what lies beneath? The earliest reports came from Antarctica, where satellites detected circular heat patterns under the ice of Wilkes Land. These patterns were faint but unmistakable. They did not spread outward like volcanic heat. Instead, they remained contained, as though confined within a structure. Beneath these warm zones lay the same geometric formations that radar scans had already revealed. Angular shapes, straight lines, grid patterns. The thermal anomalies aligned perfectly with the anomalies in the radar images. Scientists suggested geothermal activity, but geologists pointed out that the region lacks the volcanic conditions needed for such a reaction. The crust beneath Wilkes Land is stable. There are no magma plumes, no volcanic chambers, no fault lines that could produce localized heat. Something else was generating it. A similar anomaly appeared in Greenland. Beneath ice older than 12,000 years, a heat signature rose from a rectangular formation measuring nearly half a kilometre long. The pattern was not diffuse. It was sharply defined, concentrated, as though emanating from the structure itself rather than the bedrock below. When the data was published, several scientists objected. They argued that the thermal readings must be corrupted by meltwater or equipment error, but the anomalies persisted across multiple platforms, multiple satellites, multiple missions. The heat signature was real. Then came the Arctic anomaly, the most baffling of all. North of Siberia, beneath the polar shelf, submarine sensors detected a thermal zone stretching nearly a mile. The heat rose not evenly, but in pulses almost like a slow and regular heartbeat. No natural process fits this pattern. Tidal forces do not generate it. Subsurface geothermal activity does not oscillate with such consistency. The readings came back again and again. Something was pulsing beneath the ice. When these results reached academic circles, many dismissed them immediately. But the classified reports sent to governments were far less casual. Analysts noted that the pulsing resembled the kind of residual heat produced by large structures with internal cavities, like massive chambers retaining geothermal warmth, or something else. Some researchers speculated that this heat could be the remainder of ancient technology long dormant but still radiating thermal energy. They proposed that if a civilization existed in the far north before the Ice Age collapse, their structures may have incorporated heat-trapping materials or engineered internal systems that retained warmth for millennia. Others suggested the structures could sit above natural pockets of geothermal heat that ancient builders intentionally used. If the Hyperboreans understood how to harness geothermal zones, they could have built their cities around these natural power sources. When the Ice Age struck, the cities were buried, but the heat below them persisted. But one detail makes these theories more troubling. The heat anomalies match the exact points where ancient maps indicated lost northern landmasses. The Zeno map, the Piri Reis map, the Mercator polar charts, all show regions of the Arctic and Antarctic that should be land but are now buried under ice or sea. The thermal signatures appear exactly where these maps show habitable zones thousands of years ago. This has led some researchers to propose a staggering possibility: that the ancient cartographers did not simply copy maps from earlier civilizations. They copied maps from a civilization that lived in those lands before they were frozen. A civilization that knew the polar regions intimately. A civilization that built structures on land that later sank beneath ice. As the ice melts in the 21st century, it is revealing pieces of this forgotten world. In northern Canada, satellite images recently showed long, dark lines emerging from beneath melting ice fields. Researchers first assumed these were cracks, but closer analysis revealed they were arranged in perfect parallel formations. Too straight, too consistent, performing no function within any natural glacial process. In Siberia, beneath thawing permafrost, strange circular stone patterns have appeared. They resemble the astronomical enclosures of Göbekli Tepe, but they lie thousands of miles north in regions where no ancient civilization should have existed. Some are aligned to the solstices, others aligned to the pole star. Every year, more of the ice reveals more of these patterns. When heat anomalies rise beneath ancient ice, there are only three possibilities. 1. The Earth itself is warming in places never affected before due to unknown internal processes. 2. The anomalies are misinterpreted data from still unknown natural forces. Or 3. Something beneath the ice is not natural, and if it is not natural, then it must have been built. And if it was built, then it must have been built before the ice came. This is where the question becomes unavoidable. If we accept that a civilization existed in the far north before the Younger Dryas, then the heat anomalies are not mysterious at all. They are exactly what we should expect. Structures buried by ice would retain heat differently. Chambers would trap geothermal warmth. Materials would absorb and release energy. Some might even produce low-level heat if they incorporated unknown techniques or technologies to withstand cold climates. But the implications are enormous, because if these structures exist, the entire timeline of human civilization must be rewritten. Our origins did not emerge solely from river valleys or agricultural breakthroughs. Our story begins in a world destroyed by ice and remembered only in fragments. The ice is hiding something, and the heat rising through it is not simply a geological curiosity. It is a warning, a signal, a sign that the past is waking as the ice melts, which leads to a far larger and more dangerous question. What happens when the buried world of Hyperborea is no longer buried at all? Every civilization tells a story about itself, a beginning, a rise, a lineage that connects the present to a distant past. But the existence of Hyperborea does something no institution is prepared to accept. It breaks the story. It destroys the linear model of human development and replaces it with something older, deeper, and far more unsettling. Our current timeline rests on three assumptions. The first is that civilization began only after agriculture. The second is that no advanced cultures existed before 6,000 years ago. The third is that humanity progressed in a straight upward line from primitive to advanced. Hyperborea contradicts all three. If a civilization existed in the far north before the Younger Dryas, then agriculture is not the origin of civilization. It is the adaptation forced upon humanity after the fall of an older world. If megalithic engineering, astronomical knowledge, and long-distance navigation existed 12,000 years ago, then the earliest river valley cultures were not innovators, they were inheritors. And if the human timeline includes rises and falls, cycles of creation and destruction, then our history is not a straight line. It is a repeating pattern. This is the forbidden timeline, the timeline no academic institution wants to acknowledge, because it rearranges everything. The first problem is symbolic. If Hyperborea existed, then myths are not myths. They are memories. Ancient texts once dismissed as metaphors become historical sources. The Rig Veda, Greek accounts, Norse cosmology, Inuit oral histories, Vedic descriptions of a northern dawn. They all become evidence of a lost world. This alone invalidates a century of assumptions. The second problem is archaeological. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, which already challenge mainstream history, suddenly make perfect sense in a cyclical model. They are not the first experiments of early farmers. They are the reconstruction attempts of survivors. Memory stones, sky temples, designed by people who once lived in a world where the heavens circled endlessly around the pole star. The third problem is technological. If the Hyperboreans possessed knowledge of astronomy, navigation, and engineering, then the sudden explosion of advanced architecture across the globe after the Ice Age is not a miracle. It is a diaspora. It is the knowledge of a shattered culture spreading through the world like embers carried by wind. The fourth problem is genetic. The ghost lineage that appears around 12,000 years ago cannot be dismissed as noise. Its timing matches the cataclysm. Its spread matches the migration. Its isolation matches a population cut off for tens of thousands of years. It is the biological footprint of Hyperborea. But the fifth problem is the most dangerous. Hyperborea forces us to confront the possibility that civilization is not something humanity gradually builds. It is something humanity repeatedly loses. If the Younger Dryas destroyed an advanced northern world, then what we call the beginning of history is simply the latest recovery, the start of a new cycle built on the ruins of the last. Creation after destruction, light after darkness, memory after forgetting. This idea is not new. Ancient cultures across the world describe epochs, ages, or worlds that rose and fell long before recorded history. The Greeks described the ages of man. The Hindus described the yugas. The Maya described cycles of suns. The Norse described worlds destroyed and reborn. These were not poetic inventions. They were attempts to explain something humanity once knew and later forgot. Hyperborea is the key that unlocks these cycles. Because if one advanced civilization was erased 12,000 years ago, then others may have risen and fallen before it. The geological record supports this. Periodic global disasters, sudden climate shifts, cataclysms every few tens of thousands of years. A pattern of destruction so consistent that it resembles a heartbeat. The forbidden timeline restores this ancient knowledge. It does not ask when civilization began. It asks how many times it has begun. And once we adopt this perspective, the scattered anomalies of the ancient world align into a single coherent picture. The megaliths are not prototypes. They are descendants. The symbols are not inventions. They are remembrances. The myths are not fantasies. They are warnings. And the genetic anomalies are not mysteries. They are survivors. Hyperborea transforms our understanding of humanity from a straight line into a spiral, a pattern that rises, falls, resets, and rises again, a pattern of forgotten worlds. But the most unsettling implication of all is this: if history moves in cycles, then we are not living at the beginning of anything. We are living near the end. The climate instability of the 21st century is not unprecedented. The magnetic field fluctuations are not random. The strange warming patterns near the poles are not anomalies. They are the early signals of a cycle returning. The same cycle that ended Hyperborea. This does not mean a disaster is inevitable, but it does mean that the past is not finished with us. The world that came before did not vanish quietly. It left traces, it left warnings. And as the ice melts, those warnings are emerging again. The question is no longer whether Hyperborea existed. The question is why its story is returning now, because the cycle that erased it may not be a story of the past. It may be a preview of the future. There are moments in history when the past stops whispering and begins to speak. Not in symbols or myths or half-remembered stories, but in physical changes that reshape the world in real time. The melting ice, the shifting poles, the instability in climate patterns. These are not just environmental events. They are reminders, echoes, the same signals that preceded the fall of Hyperborea 12,000 years ago. For generations, humanity believed it was immune to the cycles that shaped the ancient world. Our technology insulated us. Our cities gave us confidence. Our maps convinced us we had conquered the unknown. But cycles do not care about our confidence. They unfold with or without our permission. And every ancient culture that preserved memory of the last great collapse warned of the same truth. What has happened before will happen again. Today, the Arctic is warming faster than any region on Earth. Ice that survived millennia is vanishing in decades. Permafrost is collapsing. Giant caverns are forming. Ancient organic material, frozen since the Ice Age, is thawing. And as the ice melts, it reveals not only the land beneath it, but the secrets buried within. The heat anomalies that once seemed mysterious now look like omens. The geometric shapes beneath the ice are no longer isolated curiosities. They are emerging from the frozen world piece by piece. For the first time in thousands of years, the world is beginning to look like it did before the Younger Dryas. The coastline of the north is slowly returning to its ancient shape. The Earth is remembering. Across the globe, myths that were once dismissed as fantasy are beginning to feel like history in disguise. Cultures that never contacted each other told the same story of a golden age in the north. A world of long days and long nights. A brilliant people who vanished after a great disaster. These myths were the fragments of a memory humanity had buried so deeply it became legend. But memory has a way of resurfacing. Scientific anomalies are forcing a re-evaluation of the past. Genetic studies reveal ancient lineages with no explanation. Archaeologists find sites older and more advanced than the earliest known civilizations. Linguists uncover structures in ancient texts that describe polar skies. And climate scientists track patterns that match the ancient tales of a dramatic shift. The cycle is not mythical, it is measurable. Earth wobbles, its orbit shifts, its magnetic field fluctuates, solar activity rises and falls in long, predictable waves. The combination of these forces produces periods of global instability every few tens of thousands of years. The last major shift coincided with the Younger Dryas cataclysm, and the clues suggest we may be entering another transition. This does not guarantee a disaster. Geological cycles are not clocks, but they are warnings. Hyperborea was not destroyed by a single event. It was destroyed by a sequence. A weakening environment, a changing climate, a sudden cosmic strike. The final blow came from the sky, but the collapse began long before that moment. We stand at a similar threshold, a world of increasing extremes, a planet asking us to listen. And just like our ancestors, we face a choice. Hyperborea teaches us that civilizations fall when they believe they are the first, when they assume the past contains nothing relevant to them, when they ignore the clues left behind by those who lived through cycles older than any machine or model we possess. But Hyperborea also offers something else, a path, a pattern, a reminder that humanity is capable of rebuilding, rediscovering, and remembering. The survivors of the northern world crossed continents, brought their knowledge into new lands, and laid the foundations for every civilization that followed. They carried wisdom across the ruins of their age. They adapted. They endured. That endurance lives in us. The ghost lineage carried their DNA. The megaliths carried their engineering. The languages carried their worldview. The symbols carried their memory. The maps carried their geography. And the myths carried their warnings. We are not separate from Hyperborea. We are the descendants of its survivors. And now, as the ice melts and the world shifts once again, the past is returning not to frighten us, but to prepare us. The clues across the earth are not relics. They are instructions. A guide left by a civilization that watched the sky, tracked the cycles, and built monuments aligned to the turning of the heavens. They knew what was coming. The question is whether we will listen, because as the ancient cycle begins its slow return, the world we live in will be forced to choose between ignorance and memory, between pretending we are the first or accepting that we are the seventh or eighth in a long line of forgotten worlds, between repeating the past or learning from it. Before we step into the final thought, if this journey resonated with you, feel free to like the video, share it with someone who enjoys these mysteries, and subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter we uncover together. And since many of you watch these episodes late at night, I hope you rest well when this one ends. Thank you for being here. The story of Hyperborea does not end with the ice. It ends with us, with the civilization that now stands where others once stood, with the people who must decide what to do with the clues carved into stone, encoded in DNA, hidden beneath the polar shelf, and written in the oldest myths on Earth. We are not at the beginning of history. We are living in the middle of a cycle that many before us did not survive. The true question is not whether Hyperborea existed. The true question is what the next civilization will one day remember about us.